Hi, I'm Dr. Paula Noversa. I'm the faculty director of the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese-American Archives. I'd like to welcome you to the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese-American Archives today. It's an exciting day. Every day here at the Archives is exciting, particularly this year since it's our 10th anniversary. So if you've never been to the Archives, understand that we've been here for 10 years. Where have you been? Please, if this is your first time, don't make it your last time. We have a series of interesting programs throughout the year. Please frequent us, whether you're a member of the public or staff or students. We're always welcome to all of you, and I thank you for being here. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Victor Minch. He's the director of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture. They were gracious enough to help the Archives to co-sponsor the event, so we're very happy. I'd also like to thank Clara Borges, who works at the center, who helped us with a lot of the planning. I'd also like to acknowledge Sonia Pacheco. She's in the back there. She is the archivist for the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese-American Archives, and she is always helpful with any event. And she's also here to help you as students or faculty if you need to do any research. I would always suggest that you talk to Sonia Pacheco. She can help you. Also, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the presence of the Consul for Portugal from New Bedford, Shelley Pierce. She's here, also sitting in the back discreetly, but I thank her for her appearance. We're always happy when really anyone can come to our talks, because our talks are meant to serve the Portuguese community and the student body and the faculty. So here at the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese-American Archives, really the more the merrier is always our mantra. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about not so much today's talk, but the speaker himself. So today's talk, as you know, is Eula Mendes, Portuguese migrant labor activism and the criminalization of protest. It's being given by Dr. Miguel Moniz. He is the current Flawed Brown visiting professor in Portuguese studies at Brown University. Dr. Moniz is no stranger to the region. He grew up on the Cape. He's been living in Lisbon since about 2005. He's also no stranger to this university. He did quite a bit of his research for this talk and other things that he's published here at the Archives. He is also currently a researcher at the Center for Anthropological Research at ISCTE, Instituto Universitário de Lisboa. So it is really with great pleasure that I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Miguel Moniz to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
Hi, everybody. I guess you can probably hear my voice okay this way. Good. Thank you. I just want to thank the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese-American Archives, also the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture, for inviting me to talk today to you all about what I think is a really fascinating figure in both not only Portuguese community history, but also regional and national labor history as well. The story of the labor history is often written from the point of view of different kinds of labor organizers and labor leaders. And the voices of migrants, especially industrial worker migrants that were so essential to the success of these movements and the gains that they made to advocate for the right even to protest, even though they quite often failed miserably when it came to achieving their goals of the strike. They nonetheless relied deeply upon migrants who were actually workers in these factories and in other agriculture. So in any case, I would just like to thank all of you for coming. I know, like they say on the airlines, you have many entertainment options, you have many academic options. So thank you for choosing and flying with me and Eula Mendes this afternoon. I'd also like to thank the Center, Ferreira-Mendes Archives, UMass Dartmouth in general, which I have a very long relationship with, including being a student here in the very first summer program in Portuguese, which I think was a very deeply influential moment in my life. I certainly wouldn't have studied further in academia if it was not for that program. All right, so this is Eula. Eula as an older woman, Eula with a fantastic smile. This picture of Eula actually on the right, I want to also recognize Sr. Pereira, who actually had a correspondence with her very late in her life. And this picture is actually from, it's a picture that she sent you in the late 90s, I think, yeah. So there it is. So the talk is going to be broken up in a couple of parts just to give you an idea. The first part is not really much about Eula, but will provide a historical context so that we can understand a little bit better her life and her actions. So Portuguese migrant labor activism, or labor activism in general, took place only with tremendous struggle. In the beginning of the labor movement, industrial workers, we tend to think of two things. One, we think of industrial workers as somehow being, or the labor movement as somehow being this monolithic protest movement. It was labor against the manufacturers. And in fact, it was much more complicated than that. You often had a division between craft or skilled workers and industrial workers on the one hand, and most of the industrial workers were migrants or new migrant labor, including the Portuguese, at least in the beginning from the late 1800s. And these workers were actually excluded from joining unions. And in fact, industrial workers weren't allowed to join unions. They weren't allowed to protest. They weren't allowed to even have a voice in any negotiations. Nonetheless, they were included in a number of labor movement strikes, including in Lawrence, Passaic strike, and also in Fall River as well, a little bit earlier, and in New Bedford, in the New Bedford Textile Workers' Strike of 1928. These workers, however, were ostracized not only as a result of their labor class, but were also separated as a result of discourses about racial identities as well. So when we talk about Portuguese migration to New England, oftentimes the story starts with whaling. And this is an unfortunate, I think, there's a lot of reasons for it, but if one actually looks at the breakdown numerically about who came from whaling versus who came after whaling, it's an incredible statistic. So for example, if you were to bracket off a time period from 1830 to 1930, put a line around 1870, which is when the industrial workers start to come to the US, or Portuguese industrial workers start to come to the US. From the 50-year period prior to 1870, 1% of the Portuguese came to the US. From 1870 to 1930, 99% of the people over that 100-year period came. So this idea of Portuguese coming to work on whale ships, although it's quite romantic, and actually flawed, because working on a whale ship was a miserable, miserable job anyway. It was an arduous and horrible, horrible work that especially people like Portuguese migrants would have been tasked with on most of those whale ships. But the story of Portuguese in the US is an industrial laborer story. They came mostly to work in textile mills in the usual places, including New Bedford, Fall River, Lowell, and also in agriculture out in the Cape. Places like Dartmouth, places like Little Compton. Oftentimes these communities were back and forth with each other. They all communicated with one another. If there was a labor protest movement in one city, people in another city supported that movement. There was a lot of connection between these people. People were working in agriculture, were getting recruited to work there, but also a lot of them were just coming down because they were getting laid off from mills. So these laborers were inserted into a system that was structured by languages and assumptions about slave labor that translated over to wage workers. And what was this? If anybody familiar with the Dillingham Commission reports by any chance? So, yeah, so the Dillingham Commission reports, as Gloria would tell you, presented the case against migrants, essentially. All of these hundreds of thousands of industrial workers, new migrant workers that were coming into the US, mostly from Southern Europe, other places in Asia and the Middle East. And these workers' identities were, they were low hierarchy labor groups, working in the lowest levels in the factories, lowest levels in the fields. They worked under the most arduous conditions. They had the worst pay, and it wasn't just hard work, it was dangerous work. These workers were breathing in cotton dust fibers constantly, constant problems with hearing because they couldn't hear over the din of these machines. If anybody's ever gone to boot cotton mills, for example, and heard them turn on just one or two of those machines, the sound is deafening. I can't imagine what 80 machines would have sounded like. And to be in that 6 days a week, 14 hours a day for year after year after year would have had tremendous, tremendous health effects on people's lives. These workers were marginalized in a number of ways. First off, they were marginalized by not being citizens, which meant that they didn't have a lot of constitutional or a lot of protections in terms of their ability to protest. And occupied these roles or were placed into these roles in a way that allowed for very little social mobility. Efforts by Portuguese, for example, to join craft unions was usually rejected by people in the craft unions. And part of it was a process of let's take a look here at, let's go here for a second. So the Dillingham Commission reports and general discourses at the time from politicians, from scientists, treated the Portuguese category, including Cape Verdeans, Azorians, people from continental Portugal that were coming to work in the mills, as a non-white group. If you read the Dillingham Commission reports, you see this. If you look at other work like I'll just leave this up there so you can read it, but if you look at writing by Bushy in 1903 or some of the other writers that pick up on describing these new immigrants, who are these new immigrants, who are these Portuguese? They treat them as a non-white group, place them in categories, especially in Dillingham Commission reports, with other non-white migrants and non-white workers, including blacks in the U.S. So this process was one part of limiting the rights of workers to protest and have what I call civic participation rights. There's a difference between citizenship. Oftentimes we talk about people who aren't citizens need to become citizens so that they can belong or they can be protected, have some protections. But that's only one small part of it, right? Just having citizenship alone isn't enough. You also need to have civic participation rights. You have to be able to protest without getting arrested. You have to be able to have a position, a negotiating position, when you're in a strike. None of these things were given to these industrial workers. None. Their presence in the strike was largely illegal. Once we start talking about strike of 28, this will become clear. But we also talk about voices like Taft, but he was only one academic voice writing about the Portuguese. There were several others. Kengott wrote about the Portuguese in Lowell, Massachusetts. And then you also had a couple of writers in Boston, including Bushy and Ross as well, who wrote about workers in Portuguese in Boston. These categories were invented of black and white Portuguese, and they became instrumental for workers to structure their own responses and their own protests against how their racial identities classified them and marginalized them in the U.S. So, for example, but saying white Portuguese also didn't make one white either. Was the other issue. These were still non-white workers and considered as non-white workers. So what's interesting, though, is that it did relate to social mobility for a lot of workers. So the recently deceased Noel Ignatiev and and other workers like David Roediger, or rather writers like David Roediger, they talk about this process of how immigrants become white and become American, and the process of social mobility is often talking about in terms of economics, but there's also a racial mobility that takes place as well, where workers go from being non-white to becoming white. And if you look at the Dillingham Commission reports and how they talk about a lot of groups that would be considered today white, this speaks to this process. The other thing is that a lot of times racial identities are perceived as being fixed when in fact they're quite fluid and they transform over time. In fact, racial identities are something that are constantly being created, and how migrants themselves work to create those racialized identities additionally. And what we're going to see in the community here through Eula's life are two very different strategies for combating this kind of racism and this kind of economic and political marginalization. So on the one hand, the other wrinkle to this is the way that participation in communist labor activities also made someone un-American, and how there was a conflation of all of these categories of non-white, non-American, and communist or socialist or protesting that that led to, in this early period, that were all conflated in responses to migrants in the mills who were trying to improve their conditions. And you can see this is a great political cartoon from the early 1900s that conflates alien Reds with being a migrant, and you can see how that works. So because none of the labor organizations were supporting migrants, the craft labor organizations, migrants were reliant upon other groups to support them, including most of the communist and socialist labor organizations that were working to organize workers during this time period. So you had people like you had organizations like the IWW, International Workers of the World, and the Communist Party as well. Communist Party was quite big in New Bedford even before the strike, as were a number of other socialist workers' organizations. These groups were in contrast to another process that took place, a historical process that took place of the Americanization movement. Now, the Americanization movement was an attempt to move beyond, it was a progressive movement at its base, but it was an attempt to move beyond the idea that the reason that workers were not, or that new migrants were not acceptable, or the reason that they should work in these low-level labor positions is because there were assumptions about them based on race, that they were genetically inferior and they were genetically more disposed to do this kind of work. And this was the rhetoric of Dillingham Commission reports, and this was used as a reason to not offer citizenship rights to a lot of migrants, especially those working in these low-level hierarchies. Americanization flips the script and says, well, it's not about being genetically inferior, it's about being culturally inferior. So the cultures of these individuals are what the problem is, and through good education, we can overcome those problems and turn them into Americans that respect our institutions and don't care about their old ways, which are actually inhibiting them. All of their cultural practices and cultural patterns are inhibiting them from actually having success and having mobility, and what's keeping them from actually being becoming a part of this country. It wasn't the poverty, it wasn't their work conditions, it wasn't any of this. Here's an interesting trick. The Americanization movement also developed. And so there was a huge national movement to Americanize. Portuguese associations became deeply engaged with the Americanization movement. They embraced it wholeheartedly. In fact, the national organizations, non-migrant organizations that were promoting this, reached out to they reached out to immigrant newspapers, they reached out to local associations and got them on board with a lot of these activities. And in fact, this whole push of changing of names from Portuguese to English was a part of this, of the Americanization movement, this whole push of transforming the goals of organizations, also changing charters. This was all part of the Americanization movement. And the idea was one, to downplay Portuguese cultural habits, two, to try and make the Portuguese white through Americanization. So, let's talk about Eula. This is our broad context for her participation in this labor movement. And I'm just going to read you. I've been working on Eula for a while, based on the archives here, as well as a number of other sources, newspaper reports. Diário de Notícias has been a great source also of research for this. New Bedford Standard Times. I also would, at this point, would really like to mention, he's on vacation this week, or he would have been here, but Daniel Georgiana is an important, really important figure in the story of Eula Mendes, as are people like Penreeve and Jack Stouter, who were all individuals who they interviewed her, they promoted knowledge about her. No one would know about, really would know about Eula if it wasn't for Dan Georgiana and some of the other people that did these interviews with her in the strike of '28. So this is sort of truncated from a much longer piece. So I will, I'll just read some of this to you about her life, and we'll stop along the way to make different remarks. So Eula Mendes, who was born in 1910, her family they were working people. Her father, she's from Gouveia, Portugal. Her father was actually an operário. He worked in mills and had a tremendous amount of experience as a syndicalist. In Portugal at this time period, you had a prominent anti-monarchist movement, and you also had a large unionization movement. In fact, many of the people that came from the north of Portugal were recruited to come here to work specifically in mills. They actually arrived here with a great consciousness of labor movements in general. They arrived here with a consciousness of, what it meant to participate, what it meant to go on strike, what it meant to protest. And Eduardo Mendes, he arrived here with this consciousness. And in fact, he would be deeply influential in the life of Eula. He really promoted her interest and piqued her interest in labor activism at a couple of key moments in his life. So this also presented a bit of some conflicts among different geographies of Portuguese. So whereas many of the continental Portuguese that were coming to work in the mills had all this experience with labor movement activism, most of the people from Cabo Verde and from the Azores did not. They were farmers. And when they arrived here, there was some conflict in the initial stages of trying to get them to join the labor movement. And in fact, they did not. In the initial stages, although eventually they would go on and become instrumental in the movement and also important organizers themselves, some people from those communities. So Ed Mendes considered his work, his contract that he had, to be indentured servitude. He worked at a cordage factory in Brockton, thought the conditions were horrible, his pay was terrible, so bad that he ended up having to, both Eula, her brother, and her mother actually had to go back to Portugal for about 5 years, while Ed tried to make more money and save up money. Her father insisted, though, that she be able to keep in touch with the family, and pushed her to read. So he said that she would have to write him and try and keep up with him, try and keep up with him, keep up with news from her life and his life and all this. And so she would read everything. She was an avid and voracious reader. She learned, she said, by picking up little scraps of paper on the ground. Everything that she saw that had words on it, she would read it. And was able to, this would serve her well later on when she became the union secretary. So Eula then goes back, she comes back in around 1915, 1915-ish or so. At this point, her father was working in a shoe factory in a shoe factory also in Brockton, and he worked with Sacco and Vanzetti. They were colleagues of his, and when the Sacco and Vanzetti trial hit, this became a major cause célèbre, not only for for this around the world, but it was big in this region. It happened in Massachusetts. There's actually another sort of side story about a Portuguese gangster from New Bedford who claims responsibility for the murders, although he's on death row actually with Sacco and Vanzetti. He ends up getting executed the same night that they get executed, claiming the entire time that it was he who had killed, working for the Providence Mafia, that he had killed these two payroll agents that supposedly Sacco and Vanzetti were being executed for. And they would talk about it. Ed Mendes would have people come over in his house and would talk about Sacco and Vanzetti. And for Eula, this was a big deal. So according to Eula, she said that whatever the reasons the police and courts gave, this was the impression that her father gave her, the two immigrants were really being persecuted for being radicals who wanted better conditions for the workers, and because of that they were arrested, and now they are up for the death sentence. It's an interesting quote because the same thing would happen to her, although not the death sentence, but she would eventually be deported as a result of her labor activist work. So Ed Mendes, about this time, he gets very sick. They move to New Bedford. He's sick. He can't really work in a factory anymore. And he ends up getting support from local associations. He belonged to every association that existed, was a broad participant, an active participant in community life. The community ends up taking up a collection for him, and he gets a loan so that he can own a small shop. The problem with this is that he needs to pay back the loan, and there's no work for him. He can't really work. He's working in the shop. It's not a lot. It doesn't give a lot of money. His wife tries to go to work. Eula's mother tries to get a job in the factory. The problem is she's completely unable to get a job in the factory because of the wages required for an older woman. It was much more expensive if you were an older woman to get a job in the factory. So they send Eula at 14 years because she was cheaper, easier to hire her, and Eula at 14 years becomes the primary breadwinner of her family. She earned $7 a week working as a doffer in the carding room. This is very difficult work. She basically had to pick up these big bobbins, flip them over. She's not very good at it. She's very tiny and diminutive. I don't know if you can see in some of the pictures that you can see her when she's lined up with other people. She's very small, was not very strong at 14. And she felt, though, that a real spirit of community in the carding room allowed her to get, to work. People would pick up the slack for her sometimes. Sometimes they would cover for her if she couldn't do certain things. She worked there for 4 years when the strike of '28 hit. She hated this work. She actually tried to get work as a weaver, but was not very good at it. Just didn't have an aptitude, in her words, for it, and ends up working in the carding room for 4 years when the strike of '28 occurs. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that this battle between the craft workers and the unskilled workers carried out with the strike. So the textile committee, or rather the textile council, was the craft workers union's representative. They had a legal right to represent workers in the strike. They could negotiate with the manufacturers. They encouraged the industrial workers, all the immigrants, most of the 30,000 or so Portuguese, or 30,000 or so workers that were in the strike, were mostly made up of industrial workers. Most of those were Portuguese, and encouraged them to also strike, even though they would have no voice in negotiations. This was rectified eventually by the textile mill committees, which was a group of there were a group of organizers that came out from the Communist Party mostly, and some from the IWW, but it's mostly Communist Party organizers. And they created an industrial worker union. And you can see in this very famous picture, no craft division. The women fight shoulder to shoulder with the men. Young workers, old workers, we all fight together. These kind of messages of solidarity were directed at the Textile Council, which was rejecting these other industrial workers. And again, the rejection of them was because it limited their ability to many of the industrial the craft workers were older migrants that had come from places like England, Scotland, or some other migrants who had achieved that racial mobility from migrant, non-white to white industrial worker or skilled worker on the way to their own social mobility process. So there wasn't really a lot of support for these industrial workers. The associations actually provided the most amount of support for them. They raised money for strikes. They participated also in, in helping workers to find, if they got hurt. There were insurance schemes that they created, and in general supported the strikers through charitable through a lot of charitable activities. So here's some images here of Bread and Lawrence strike. These were other regional strikes that took place in which tentatively industrial workers organized. As they organized, they started to learn also. From one strike to the next, the leaders would move around and learn. One thing that they learned was that it was very difficult to speak to migrant industrial workers. Most of the organizers didn't speak Portuguese. And so what they really needed were people who could act as strike captains, people who could, the way that the strike was organized so that all the workers in one mill would protest together. And it was easier to get the word out to different groups of people. Obviously, there were no phone calls or, if you wanted to get the word out, you actually had to have somebody go and communicate to people directly. So these workers that were recruited were people like Eula Mendes. Now Eula saw these speeches by the strike leaders, Biedenkap and Biel, and she was captivated by them. I mean, they talked a lot like her father did in some ways. I'll give you a quote of her talking about some of these. And she really was just deeply moved by these people. At one point, Fred Beale comes, distributes 10,000 pamphlets across the city, and Eula is just completely impressed with these people. She says, just the way that he talked about things, why we have to be solid, why we have picket lines, the importance of that, and the importance of the demands of what we want, and so on. And he was also explaining the name, the words radical, Bolshevik, communist, militant, and all these things, because these were words being used by the newspapers as something terrible, and he was explaining what those things were. So one of the ways that they attacked the strike was by attacking the politics of the individuals who were fighting for the strike. So only people representing migrant workers are the progressive, the socialists and communists. And this gets attacked as being an un-American activity. They're not about getting rights. It's not about getting better rights. It's about overthrowing New Bedford, overthrowing our city institutions, overthrowing our government, right? And that's a neat little trick, isn't it? Because what's really happening here is they want to stop all these people who are actually able to make the strike successful. So they do other things too. They have mass arrests of individuals as well in the process of strike breaking.
You have not mentioned the reason for the strike, which was a pay cut.
Yeah, so the strike, I didn't mention that, that's correct. There was a huge across-the-board pay cut, and the workers didn't obviously fought against this. There were other things too. They were trying to speed up the line, and a number of other issues. But yes, this was one of the things that they were protesting. So Eula starts going to meetings, and they ask her at first just to translate speeches into Portuguese. Eventually, they ask her to give the speeches herself, and she has aptitude for this. You saw that picture of her with a big smile on her face. She's a gregarious person. People who meet her are captivated by her. Her future husband there's a great quote from her future husband that I can read to you. But essentially, she starts to become active. She starts to actually do the act of organization. After a small while in the strike, she joins the executive committee. They actually ask her to join the executive committee of the strike, where she works as an organizer, not only in New Bedford, but then starts to travel throughout the region. She goes to New York. She goes to neighboring cities to try and raise money and funds for for the strike in New Bedford, and basically just to get the word out about it. Towards the end game of the strike, she also participates in some other activities. It wasn't pretty, the strike. The textile mill committees was very adamant about keeping scabs out of the city. There were a couple of instances when scabs came in. One was a takeover of the Kilburn mill, which allowed scabs to come in through the water. They kind of surreptitiously brought boats up through the water, came in through the back door. And to give you an idea of how the strike was affecting not just the workers, but the whole city in the total institution of the mills, you had fishermen who people weren't buying fish. You had shop owners, people weren't shopping in shops. So everyone was participating in this, and a group of Portuguese fishermen created a blockade around the back of the Kilburn mill to stop more scabs from coming in. In other cases, the violence that was perpetrated on the migrant workers also got perpetrated by the violent workers on others. In one case that's not really talked about, a group of women who were scabbing in a mill, and Eula was part of the executive council meeting that decided how to deal with these strikers. They ended up going to the mill, pulling the women out, stripping them naked, and keeping them from going home. Eula eventually said that people felt bad for some of the women and gave them some clothes, but this was obviously a rather violent action to take against the scabbing workers. These were more violent times, but nonetheless, you get a sense of what was happening in New Bedford at the time from some of these activities. There weren't a lot of scabs, though, in the New Bedford mill workers' strike. Part of that, though, in part, was because so many of the migrants were actually working to support the strike. So all of these mass arrests take place, and Eula ends up getting arrested dozens of times as a result of her activities. In one case, sometimes it's overnight, sometimes they're super trumped up charges that get dismissed. Other times, not so much. Eula, in the end game of the strike was the Textile Council trying to negotiate with the manufacturers to finish the strike and to cut the textile mill committees out of any of the negotiations. And they were successful at doing that because they jailed all of the leaders of the TMC, including Eula, during the final negotiations. It was these arrests that would eventually lead to her deportation further on down the road. So, I want to talk a little bit about the Communist Party. So Eula Mendes was met during the strike. She met her husband, her future husband, a man named Joe Figueiredo, who was an interesting figure. He was born in the U.S. Actually, I think I have yeah, there he is. So Joe Figueiredo was born in the U.S. He was a communist labor organizer and leader. He met Eula during one of the strike actions, and they were together for about 20 years. The end of their marriage actually is quite tragic. We'll talk about that in a second. But in any case, Joe Figueiredo was captivated by Eula. He thought she was a brilliant speaker. He thought she was a great organizer and a very captivating person. He ends up not getting deported because he's a U.S. citizen, but does speak in front of the House Un-American Activities about labor issues in New England. So other people included a strike captain named Augusto Pinto, who was not a citizen. He also got arrested several times in the New Bedford strike of '28. This is another individual that ends up getting deported. When he gets deported, however, he gets put on a ship to go to a political prison in Cabo Verde, and that is the last that's ever heard of him. He dies en route. Nobody knows what happened to him. The Communist Party was very prominent in New Bedford. Not only, first of all, the Communist Party in New Bedford was a Portuguese. It was essentially, Eula calls it a Portuguese association. She said, their activities were like, quote unquote, Portuguese picnics, as she called them. Their meetings and their get-togethers. And she talks about how the party itself had there were mixed feelings about the party within the communities. On the one hand, everybody that was in New Bedford during the strike of '28 realized what the party had done for those workers. On the other hand, as a result of the Americanization movement, as a result of a lot of this rhetoric from the newspapers, from the mayor, from other people about how the communists were un-American and were trying to destroy, the city, this created some conflicts in how people felt about them. Further, the U.S. government starts to pass a number of anti-communist acts. So you have Taft-Hartley, you have the McCarran Act, you have all of these different legal measures that are designed to keep people from, they're ostensibly designed to stop communism. But the reality is it's about stopping labor activism among these groups of people who were less represented at the time by craft worker unions. And there's two different periods of Red Scare. There's a later, so Eula commits her deportable act in the first Red Scare, but then ends up getting deported as a result of the second. Throughout, she does a lot of work for a Communist Party organization, the kind of work that she does. Let's see. She has a radio show that she participates in New Bedford. She organizes marches, meetings. There's a great battle around, there were several strikes taking place in the 30s, and one was the Lore Mill strike, that things went very, very bad there. And she, in the middle of Augusto Pinto's deportation, she wants to have all of these protest marches in New Bedford. The city refuses to give them a permit. They fight over this several times, over the course of several months. There's outreach to other communist organizations. She supports candidates for political office, including her husband, Joe Figueiredo, who never wins but often runs for some local political offices, and does other organizing for the Communist Party. She eventually goes on to work as a union secretary for the LGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And when the McCarran Act when the Taft-Hartley gets passed in 1947, Eula refuses to sign the loyalty oath. And you couldn't work as a union officer if you were a member of the Communist Party. Well, if you were a migrant union representative in 1950, the odds are that you were at one point working with a communist affiliated group, because that's who was supporting migrant workers' rights. So Eula refuses to sign the loyalty pledge and ends up getting fired from her job as a union officer for the ILGWU. At this time, she then gets subjected to deportation as a result of this. They cite her arrests early and other Communist Party work that she did, and they seek to deport her. The process takes a couple of years. It's quite messy, in fact. They move her from New England to Ellis Island, where she's in detention for a long time, about 6 months or so. She's completely cut off from any family members. Her father had died at that point. Her father dies in 1946. But she is completely isolated from everyone. And in the middle of all this, her husband, Joe Figueiredo, ends up, in her words, meeting someone prettier and younger and leaving her while she's in the middle of all this deportation issues. And this really crushes her soul, it crushes her spirit. And she essentially agrees to stop fighting against her deportation when this happens. The fact is, the handwriting was on the wall, whatever was going on in her personal life. And I think being in isolation for 6 months in Ellis Island was probably more substantial than whatever was happening with Joe Figueiredo. But in any case, she ends up getting deported to Poland. Why Poland? Fearing the fate of Augusto Pinto, who got sent back to Portugal and was killed, you have to remember that the communists at this point were also very anti-fascist. They sponsored many, many marches and fundraising efforts against Franco on the side of the, of the left in the Spanish Civil War, and also spoke out vociferously in many cases against Salazar and the Estado Novo. This was the case, this was Augusto Pinto's case, and Eula feared that what she had said and how she had protested against Estado Novo would end up, she would end up with the same fate as Augusto Pinto. So she decides to go to Poland. Poland was taking a number of people, especially Greeks, some from the Greek Civil War, but also a number of Greeks who also were getting deported from the U.S. and and didn't want to go back as a result of what might be happening in Greece as a result of the Civil War. And in 1953, this is shortly before her. This was taken shortly before she got deported. She gets sent to Poland. She was very upset with the way that the community responded to her deportation in some ways. On the one hand, there's a picture that she takes for the newspaper where she holds her hands over her face. And she hates this picture, hates it. And the reason that she gives for hating it, if you read between the lines, on the one hand, why should she have been ashamed that this was happening to her? Like, the people that should be ashamed would be the people that were arresting her on these ridiculous charges, But she also felt that way, she said, because in the community, she felt like a lot of the people that were getting deported, and her activities were actually, her activities as an organizer, her activities with the Communist Party were in some ways seen as bad for the Portuguese communities. Not because of the work that she was doing, but because of the impression this made about who the Portuguese communities were. So once again, we circle back to this, what we were talking about in the beginning of this talk, as I'm wrapping it up, which is that, how the Portuguese were classified in terms of racial identity, political identity. These were all ways to exclude and marginalize them from civic participation, from an ability to have a participation in a community, from an ability to be able to protest, from the ability to not get arrested protesting, to have a voice. And there were these two strategies that got taken place, which one was, well, we'll use associations to participate in the Americanization movement, and this will allow us to continue all of the Portuguese cultural activities that we constantly and consistently do. However, we can rewrite how those activities are seen. They won't be seen as un-American. If we present a case about ourselves as being white and American, then we will be able to to have some success at social mobility, which was also related to racial mobility. Diário Noticias, for example, there's a great column in Diário Noticias in 1941 in the heat of a lot of these debates about Portuguese communist participation, in which they vociferously denounce communism, not only as being un-American, but the tenor of the column is that it was not only un-American, but that it was un-Portuguese. And using Salazar and fascism as a way to say, look at how American we are, which is pretty telling. So the idea, at least in this column in the Diário Noticias. So the idea was to say that, fundamentally fascism or fundamentally the Estado Novo is against communism, is a blow against communism. So this is again, this is not being talked about in Portugal. This is something that's being talked about in these communities, right? And what they were addressing was local marginalization, local exploitation. How were these local migrant groups being? How were they able to participate in local political activities? So Eula gets deported in '53, and we can see how how her work was contrary to a lot of the Americanization goals of many of these associations. One of them that I would highlight was in 1952 in Newport, there were bylaws being rewritten that tried to take head-on some of these ideas about Portuguese identities, in which they changed the bylaws to include and said that any person of the white race of Portuguese descent or extraction could join the club. And this was obviously an attempt to transform, both to work with that white Portuguese, black Portuguese category, and as Noel Ignatev, rest in peace, talks about, it was a way for Portuguese to become white by making sure that other people were not. And the rhetoric of black and white Portuguese was something that was created outside of the Portuguese communities. However, it's something that ends up getting adopted by the Portuguese communities themselves in these discourses of belonging and racialized identities and the like. Just as a kind of a closing remark, what I would like to talk a little bit about is that one of the main ways that we talk about Portuguese identities and social mobility in New England is to talk about assimilation. And I think, though, that assimilation is not the right way to go about talking about what happened. What I would talk about is assimilability. And the difference between assimilability and assimilation is that assimilability is a constant argument that individuals are making about their belonging. And, so for the Portuguese, this is a debate that still goes on. It started, we can look at how these migrant groups in the early 20th century, the way that racial identities, the way that political activism played out with these communities, I think is still very much prevalent today when we look at Portuguese groups or Portuguese migrants still making arguments about their assimilability, that is, their belonging, whether they should belong or not, and what it means to belong. And it's not just the Portuguese, this is everyone. All new migrant groups are facing this. There's this sort of debate about Portuguese that they, unlike a lot of other migrant groups, they moved into places, New Bedford, Fall River, where they were the last group of migrant mill workers, industrial workers. And this is true to an extent, but it's also not true, because eventually there was another group of migrants. It was just other Portuguese. And if you look at discourses between older migrants from Portugal and newer migrants from Portugal, the whole, the greenhorns, and this kind of language, this was another way for older groups of migrants to do the same thing. They were participating in these discourses of assimilability, talking about their own identities by way of saying other people were less American than they were. The distinctions that get made between older generations and newer generations is one activity. And a lot of those migrants that came in the 60s and 70s and 80s, well, guess what? They're starting to do the same thing now with newer migrants from other parts of the world, from Southeast Asia and all of these places. Well, I think that that's, I think that if we can think about and talk about all these power inequalities and be really honest about what's going on here and jump off this train of acquiescence to the white nationalist power discourses that permeate not only discussions about race, but permeate discussions about labor and class, then we could perhaps create a more cooperative and a more sustainable and a more just society that actually deals with or actually is able to address problems of power inequalities and discrimination. It's a tall task, but usually when we have these debates, we're talking about people with power having those debates against migrants. But what we really need to be doing is talking about other migrants and the way that they have those debates with other migrants as another part of that process. So I think that this brief sort of discussion about Eula Mendes and her life, how she was received by the community, the work that she did helps to explain that a little bit. So in closing, I would just like to leave you all with a couple of quotes from Eula. And let's see. I would ask that, that Gloria, if you could read this.
Most of those people who were deported had to go to countries they had not seen, had not lived in, and most of them had been brought to the United States when they were children. And it meant quite a break for them to leave a country where they grew up. For example, with me, I grew up and everything I learned in the United States. The question of not only learning the language, but whatever ideas I learned there. It was really breaking up a home. It's not easy to leave a country where you grew up, not necessarily where you were born, but where you grew up, and where your life was involved there with so many friends and so many people and everything else. Then to have to go to a completely different country with a completely different language. And it wasn't easy for me to learn Polish. I still do not know Polish very well. And you have to start a completely new life, new people, of course. New people. Of course, the people here were very friendly. I think she's referring to people in Poland. I was deported because I was not a citizen. But the question of picking on foreign-born people was used during the McCarthy days as a pressure against people generally. And my arrest in New Bedford had an effect of creating a lot of fear amongst a lot of Portuguese people who were not citizens. And this question of arresting so many at a time all over the country also had that effect.